Well, good afternoon and welcome to Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersects in a changing world. This is the breakout session on artificial intelligence, or AI. My name is Curtis Baxter. I'm a senior program associate in the DoSER program, and I've been with the program for about since 2014. I work on a number of projects at the nexus of science, technology, theological education, and in congregational and congregational settings. I'll be the moderator for this session. Just a little few housekeeping items. Before we start, reminder that closed captioning is available for this session. You may click the live captioning button at the bottom of your screen to turn captioning on and off and adjust the settings. There will be time for questions near the end of this session. So please, we invite you to enter your questions by using the Q&A button. And so you can also upvote others' questions as well in that same button as well, that same box. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded as well. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is increasingly a part of our daily life, which means forefront research in this field has significant societal implications. Our panelists today will explore current advances in AI, the positive and negative implications, and engagement opportunities for the general public and religious communities as well in our discussion. We'll be discussing our discussion as well. Our panelists for this session are Dr. Phillip Butler. He is an assistant professor of theology and Black Posthuman AI systems at Iliff School of Theology. And we also have Dr. J. Nathan Matias, associate professor in the Department of Communications at Cornell University. Both Dr. Butler and Dr. Matias have given me permission to use their first names from here on out. So I'll use Phillip and Nathan from here on out. Usually folks like to read off bios, but here we want to do a little more interesting. So I'm going to give each of our panelists a few minutes to talk a little bit about who they are and what they do before we begin our conversation. So I'm pleased to, and it's my pleasure, to invite Phillip to start us off.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Phillip Butler. I'm really glad to be here, excited to be in this conversation today. A little bit about myself. As Curtis kind of said, I'm a professor at Iliff School of Theology. I am the founder of the Seeker Project. It's a distinctly Black artificial intelligence agent with mental health capabilities, where we've trained it on 3 different modalities. For those who are familiar with internal family systems therapy, narrative psychology, and cognitive behavioral therapy, it oscillates between those 3 modalities depending upon the direction of the conversation with the user. We have been building Seeker since at least this particular iteration of Seeker since about 2018, and it's seen drastic changes in the last few years, and even more so as I kind of recently finished my own level 1 training within IFS itself. And so the broadening of my own knowledge base within these psychological modalities has impacted robot as well. And we've been working to get this in folks' hands as a way to provide readily accessible Seekers 24/7 available and very low cost mental health, not only resources, but just a conversational conduit to help folks, self-reflect and find space for themselves. And then the second thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is about the work that we do at the Iliff Institute. We work on artificial intelligence. It's the 80/20 project that we're working on right now. And so this is a new way to work through computer vision. Within the last few years, there have been a lot of researchers kind of pointing out the ways in which darker skinned individuals and dark skinned women have not been seen by computer vision devices. And what we also recognize is that there's a lot of error when it comes to recognizing these folks on a broader scale. And so we've seen that there have been some advances in this, but what we want to do is kind of building off of these technologies, create something much different through this data set that is more reflective of the larger kind of global majority. And so the data set will be one where it'll be 80% folks from the global majority, 20% really less than 20% white folks. And the idea is to create not only spaces that data sets that allow for black folks and more darker skinned folks to be seen, but we also are building this for there are two kind of novel distinctions. One is consent based, and so we're not going around scraping the internet to find to people's pictures without consent. We know that has negative ramifications in the long run. We've seen it already. And then the second thing is we're giving people the opportunity to self-identify, meaning that how somebody understands itself along the various scales of social location, they'll be able to label their own pictures, because currently vision data sets are pre-labeled by other people. So being labeled by oneself, we're hoping to force the machines to see people as people see themselves. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Phillip. And now, Nathan, I invite you to share a little about your story and your background.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Matias, an assistant professor at Cornell, where I lead the Citizens and Technology Lab, a research organization that advances a world where digital power is guided by evidence and accountable to the public. Before grad school, I was an engineer tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of predictive text AI systems. And if you've ever struggled with those, you know how important that evaluation work is. And as part of my outreach and service as an academic for 15 years now, I've been engaging on topics of faith and artificial intelligence with church communities, gatherings of religious engineers, and also academic conferences. And I want to give a couple of examples of the kinds of questions that have come up in these conversations. So as you know, much of what we understand and feel about the world is shaped by AI. When you read an email newsletter, check social media, or look at the news, you see what's been chosen by an algorithm that observes your behavior and the patterns of millions of other people. For those of us who are people of faith, the people we pray for, the causes we support, and even the money we give are all influenced by these algorithms. If something's already popular, it'll get more attention. And in a world of inequality and discrimination, religious traditions offer important alternatives to systems that reinforce what's already popular. And sometimes it can be a real problem. When Wilmer Catalan Ramirez was tackled in his Chicago home by immigration agents, threatened with deportation and detained in March 2017, he couldn't understand why. They had no warrant, he had no criminal record, and his only encounters with the police had been random stops in his neighborhood. Unknown to Catalan, his name was actually added to a Chicago predictive policing system after he was injured in a drive-by shooting. This system, according to police, was designed to offer better support to communities. In practice, police prioritized people in communities on the list, trapping them in a cycle of escalating suspicion. And as communities are affected by these kinds of issues and questions, and even as faith organizations and religious communities consider implementing systems like this of their own, they have lots of questions about both what are these systems doing, what are the impacts on their communities, and also how can they think about these things from a thoughtful perspective as people of faith. And those are some of the conversations I support across a range of communities.
Thank you, Nathan, for that. And so now, one thing that really I'd like to ask when we start this conversation off is to what drew you both to the work that you do and the work that you're doing, in academia and in the public square. And we'll start with Nathan for this one.
Yeah, so as a Guatemalan American whose family moved to the US during the Guatemalan Civil War and genocide, I think I've always been drawn to questions about what it means to hold a power accountable. As a person of faith, I also think about the story in the book of Acts in the early Christian church of people who actually did an audit of the apostles, right, the founders of the faith, over their distribution of resources, and how that actually made a constructive contribution to the fundamental structures of Christianity. Over the years, as I was in industry and then moved into academia, I realized that as much as people want the systems they create to do good in the world, we often have a scarcity of evidence about just what the impact of those things ends up being. One person I often think of, who was a fellow grad student of mine at MIT, Joy Buolamwini, did this remarkably revealing and influential study to show how much facial recognition systems perform differently for dark-skinned faces, for women's faces compared to lighter male faces. And it profoundly shaped how people in industry and policy thought about those systems, because they hadn't realized just how badly they were performing and how disparate the impacts were until someone did the research to study those problems. And so I think that even as there's an important role for people to create new systems that can make a difference in our world, there's a profoundly important role for society, both people of faith and broader community, to also study and hold to account the systems that have so much power today.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. Phillip, questions to you.
Sure. I got so enthralled in what Nathan was saying, I almost forgot the question. But for myself, I remember just going back to coursework, right? My PhD program. I initially went to Cornell School of Theology just to study neuroscience and spirituality kind of broadly, and was interested in just kind of the neurophysiology of spiritual experiences. But I also went to my coursework was during the time of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Corey Gaines, Sandra Bland. The list just goes on and on, to this day. And so I had to reimagine who my work was for, the people that claim me, that I claim, that I care about the most, that I'm looking for a different future. Like, what is the future for Black folks? What is it going to be? And because this president is not the one that I think that we are after. And so this became a driving force in just kind of reimagining the future of my own scholarship and the kind of the trajectory of how I see my life's work. And so, when we talk about something like the 80-20 project, it's definitely building off of that same work that Nathan was talking about in terms of Joy Buolamwini, right? And Timneka Brew, and so many other women, right? who are leading the way in being critical of the way in which industry is reifying, kind of white supremacist and white male kind of heteronormative gazes through these kind of digital spaces. And then even with the Secret Project, right, this first iteration on mental health is something that I think is particularly important. And we, for those that have watched kind of the Apple WGC this past week, we now know that Siri, I think, has a Black voice. But the question becomes, right, like, what does it mean for not only Siri to have a Black voice, but also be culturally relevant, to have a level of competency, right, and self-reflexivity and ability to relate, to be, by Black folks and for Black folks, and again, to just kind of have these spaces be something that stems from the experience, that sense of Blackness. And so, this becomes a driving force in why I do what I do, in creating new futures for the folks that. I've got 2 kids, man. The world's got to be different by the time they come of age, and this is part of this is why why we do what we do.
Well, thank you both. I totally understand. I just had our first child as well, so I know we need a better future, not just for our children, but for all children as well out there. And so both of you talk about a little bit about the communities that you engage with a little bit in your intros and in this question. So How does your work empower those communities that you interact with within your academic, but in particular what you do outside the academic realm as well? So does it make them more aware of of how AI is in their life almost ubiquitously? Maybe not if they're not have a lot of smartphones and things like that. Does it make them more aware and more cognizant of how they share their data and information on the internet? And does it make them want to be more a part of the conversation in regards to, as like the 80-20 project, in regards to your work, Nathan, in regards to churches in particular, make them want to be more part of the conversation and to have more influence in where the technology ought to go and how ethics is addressed in it as well. I'll start with Phillip with that one.
Yeah, no, I think folks are definitely becoming more interested in at the very least more the high level, if not so much the nuances of like what's happening, and just being aware that, if the platform is free, then then you are the product, things of that nature, and then being able to recognize that behavior is something that is kind of widely tracked in digital spaces and not just kind of physical spaces, right? There really isn't a way to remove oneself from this kind of panoptic reality that we exist in, and then finding ways to kind of swell up from the, kind of swell from the bottom up, where people who are more cognizant of the ways in which their data, right, and the ways in which AI is impacting or influencing their lives is something that they can either be a part of shifting the landscape in terms of where it goes, or at the very least find ways for them to not just kind of be the battery in the matrix, so to speak, where they just are feeding this kind of infinite loop until the data that they produce is no longer being produced by them because they're dead, right? And so it's just I think for that there's an interest in knowing more, and I think even more so some folks are becoming more curious about how they can then shift and flip the system as a result.
Thank you, Nathan.
So here are some of the ways that I've worked with communities. In my academic research, I collaborate directly with the public in citizen science that both looks at the impact of social technologies in people's lives and also tests ideas for change. When we look through the history of governance and regulation and accountability over new industries, we see over and over again that a combination of citizen scientists and academic researchers often were doing critical work that informed the public before governments even knew what questions to ask about regulation. You can look at the history of food safety, drug safety, auto safety, the environment, so many areas where people kind of did DIY science that helped keep them and their families and communities safe before we knew how to regulate. And in many ways, that's what my lab does. We invent the DIY science of safety and accountability for our digital environments. More broadly, when engaging with faith communities, there are a few ways that I've done that, and I actually think there's a beautiful parallel between some of the ways that Philip's work plays out and mine has. Yes, some of it has to do with awareness and helping people understand the role of AI in society. Another layer, though, especially because these systemic technologies can't necessarily really be addressed at the level of individual decisions. You have to look elsewhere, right? And that's where events like hackathons that bring together engineers of faith to think critically about how they design technologies, or academic conferences to bring together people to discuss how theology relates to the science they're doing in computer science, or work to help Christian leaders and organizations know how to take action on social issues, are all areas where even when an individual might not easily be able to make decisions that impact whether they're surveilled or whether a system is making decisions for them, people can still come together and create systemic change as communities of faith.
Thank you, Nathan and Philip, for answering that question. Before moving on to the next question I have for you both, I want to invite our audience to put some questions in the Q&A button, so we can have some questions from the audience that our wonderful panel, our two panelists can answer. If not, I'll keep asking questions. I think I got some roaming around in my brain right now. But we always got to have this question, I think, and so this is a to the future question here. And so looking to the future, could you give some insight into what we may see develop in the fields of AI, the challenges that might bring, as well as what are the, and we always want to have this promising note of hope, and what are the promising aspects of that technology as well? That technology might be happening right now with this, that can be happening. So to the future, we're looking to the future for a little bit. And once again, I invite folks to upload their questions. So I'll start with Nathan.
Yeah, I think there are some specifics and then kind of an important meta point. I think it's really important for societies to have in place the structures that ensure that the future is going to work for human society in a good way. There are all manner of things we can invent, and the pace of innovation is astonishing in AI. One example would be a religious organization that came to me, and they publish online a very popular set of religious materials, and their data science team was wondering if we could create predictive models for the trajectory of what someone learns about our faith. Could we use that information to tailor and customize and intervene in order to increase the number of people who become converts or otherwise help people along their way? And that's a social science question, that's a computer science question. It's ultimately a theology question. And you would want to know if, as a religious community, if that system is steering you in a way that's good or not. And just putting something out into the world and hoping it works is a pretty risky prospect. And so my hope for the future, as the EU, as the US considers different kinds of new laws about algorithmic accountability, will be that we'll start to get into place both the regulations and the scientific methods that we still need to invent that allow us to actually achieve a future where AI works well for society. I think there are huge potential gains in mental health, something I know Philip's thought about, in all sorts of areas of medicine, in our ability to coordinate effectively with each other, and even in some areas, like I study online harassment, where we can significantly reduce the number of people who have to look at horrible things on the internet just to govern our digital spaces. Another area where you can make there are huge benefits to AI, but it needs to be in the context of the governance capacities to ensure that those systems are actually serving society.
Thank you, Nathan. Philip, to the future.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we are, I guess, like maybe two things that I'll highlight, right? The first one is rebiasing, right? In terms of AI, right? We recognize that bias is something that is difficult to mitigate, and is also not necessarily going anywhere. And so I think one of the things, one of the ideas we're playing with right now is this idea of rebiasing. So if we want a different world, if we want different outcomes, if we want to steer people in different directions, then we've got to. I think that AI has to be intentional about the ways in which it's intentionally biased towards whatever outcome it wants. If it wants a more quote unquote just world, or a quote unquote more ethical world, or so on and so forth, and it's got to be honest about that and build that into the system that it's making. The second one I think is this piece around locality. Now we talk about kind of decolonization and even being anti-colonial in certain respects. the more accurate our systems become in terms of AI, then we're not just talking about creating increased customization at the individual level. We're also talking about making that interoperable amongst the communities that these individuals are a part of. And so that is also that is a way of creating complexity and flux within the local systems in which people are moving. And one of the things we're thinking about particularly is what does it look like to have a data set for certain neighborhoods. We also kind of what Nathan was talking about, what are the potential dangers for that? Because if you have a data set that reflects a certain neighborhood, if you have somebody come into that neighborhood who does not reflect what that neighborhood looks like, in the back end, then how are these people flagged again, right? And then the question becomes, how many do we allow to come into this new neighborhood before we create a flag, and this, so on and so forth. So the question becomes, what does locality look like? And then what does interoperability amongst individuals in a space look like to maintain a sense of kind of cultural identity? Like, I think it's the summertime, and I'm from the DC area. Like, what does it mean, for folks who listen to go-go music and things like that? What is it for those cultures to be maintained in these local spaces, not just in certain pockets of the city, but also as part of its kind of its historical heritage, but also be brought into its kind of future as well through the artificial intelligence that's helping to maintain it. All right, and so I think those are two things amongst others, right, that I think are particularly interesting about the future of AI.
Wonderful, thank you both. No, that's very insightful. So we have roughly about 5 minutes left. We have one question did come in from our audience, and I think I could pose this to both of you, but it might be more aligned with what Nathan was talking about in regards to governance. And the question was, who should be the regulator? Who should be the regulators of AI? And maybe that's for both of you. And I'll start off with Nathan on that, and Phillip, if you want to chime in, please do.
I think people often think about finding like that one party that's going to be able to exercise power towards a just world. And I think when we look at the social science of governing complex systems, I especially think, for example, of the work of the late Elinor Ostrom and how complex systems like the environment and pollution are governed. What ultimately happens in a stable system is that you have a number of competing entities that are in this like co-evolutionary race. And we see this starting to happen, and we need more of this competition, where, of course, tech companies have an important role to play. Governments are creating regulations, and they have that power. People often ignore the governance work that are done by communities, especially marginalized communities. There's a lot of invisible labor that tech companies actually delegate to users that kind of does amount to AI governance. And I've written a number of articles about this over the years. And I think also there's a profoundly important role for communities of faith as well. I think, for example, in 2013, when Christian, Jewish, and Muslim organizations worked together in a lawsuit against the US government to protect rights of association from mass surveillance and data collection related to AI. That was an example of a case where religious communities took leadership on an incredibly important religious rights case that was deeply connected to questions of AI. So as we think about governance, there's an important role for civil society and for the parts of civil society that are deeply religious.
Yeah, and I think this is one thing that I haven't touched on yet, to even kind of extend Nathan's point, is about kind of data citizenry, right? The UK right now is building a data trust. I think the US is probably going to take the more privatized route around that, but nevertheless, what does it mean for people to be data citizens, but also to own the data, or at the very least the data set of their behaviors, the choices that they make, and their identity. And so when that comes into play and we start talking about governance, right, then the people in many cases are already choosing the direction of things by how they move. But I think when when we start talking about making ultimate decisions, I think this becomes a combination of transparency by the bodies who are creating new technologies, along with along with a dependence upon the user and the role that they play in, again, kind of shifting things based upon their behavior. So to me, I put the hands in the power of the people because I think, again, that they ultimately are the ones that are going to be affected the most. If anybody has any weight in the transhumanist future, kind of at least it is in a philosophical sense that we're building, then the whole point is to give people a sense of freedom based upon the ways in which everything is already kind of set in stone for them to support that. And so if we're gonna create a governance policy, then that subsequent policy is gonna also have a large economic kind of shifts, and that then will give people a chance to actually be freer in a sense. But again, that's only if you buy into to that particular line of thought. But yeah, ultimately to the people.
Thank you both for that. So there's another question from the audience. Do you think that the application of AI in faith-based initiatives provides a qualitatively different approach to ethics? The ethics in AI, and they keep on and they continue on to say that is faith more than just another application for AI, but rather a perspective that can inform applications of AI that must be ethical. Hope y'all got that. And we'll start with Phillip on that one if you want to take that one. If not, we can pass it on to Nathan.
Sure. No, I think that's fair. And so, I mean, I think one of the underlying thoughts we have at the Institute of Iliff is that folks who have theological training should be involved in the process of the creation of artificial intelligence, right? And we talk about especially the type of theological thought that is critical, that is introspective, that is decolonial, right? That is more than just your traditional humanities route that you would get at maybe a larger PWI institution, because we've seen what that has done and where that has led us, and so we think that a broader, more diverse, more critical approach from a theological background would be helpful, and so it is a particular stance, it is a particular perspective that would hopefully, right, bring more folks from the global majority, more folks from different sexual and gender perspectives, and different life experiences to the table, all right, to create a different type of kind of system altogether.
Nathan, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think we have good evidence that when people of faith come to questions about artificial intelligence, they sometimes ask questions that other people wouldn't ask otherwise. Most famously, Rosalind Picard coming to the topic of what intelligence means and having a more substantive vision that ends up launching the subfield of effective computing. It's not just rational thought. You have to account for emotion. Or more recently, you have people like Aman al-Rakib, who's doing really fascinating work on artificial intelligence and Muslim thought. And so I think another example would be Karthik Dinakar at MIT, who's done some really beautiful thinking about how notions from Hindu traditions might lead to breakthroughs in how we think about those context-dependent questions that Phillip was talking about. How do you make a general intelligence that accounts for difference in the world? And so I think that within the field of computer science, we have examples of people who've done that kind of work. And then on top of that, I think the ethical and moral frameworks that communities of faith bring to the world can also be a profoundly valuable resource for thinking about the governance of AI as well.
Thank you. And so an audience member posed this question, I think is quite apropos to our current state here in America and as well as around the world. And so the question goes, how might AI be used to help control or contain, contain is their word, I shouldn't say control, contain growing problems in extremism and fake news? Anybody want to, Phillip, or I think, Phillip, you want to try to answer that one, or Nathan? It's a toss-up question there.
So this is related to my research. A number of the communities I work with worry about these things. And first, we should acknowledge that there are deep concerns that artificial intelligence is contributing to these problems. I mentioned earlier that we have software systems that learn what's popular, or that learn what people tend to click on and view, and try to give them more of the same. And there's an ongoing debate that I think is still kind of open at this stage about the degree to which violent extremism is being propagated by algorithms that are kind of putting people into this tunnel vision of information. Good evidence for, good evidence against, and we're still inventing the science to understand. And that's a real problem for the designers of these algorithms, where it's not clear whether they're causing greater violence and extremism in society, and an ongoing area of governance. I think we do have some interesting examples of efforts at using artificial intelligence to try to manage and intervene, where people have used systems to detect problems as they unfold and emerge. We're also seeing artificial intelligence being used to try to identify hatred and intervene when it's observed. But of course, those systems have their own downsides and their own biases. And there are a number of studies that have shown that those content moderation systems can be highly biased against marginalized groups. And so again, I find myself coming back again and again to this question of the profound need for high quality evidence on the impact of these systems. If you throw another AI system after an AI system that you think is causing harm, that just puts two AI systems into the mix. And if you don't have good evidence on what those systems are actually doing, it's really hard to know if you're helping or hurting.
Yeah, I wouldn't add to even too much to what Nathan was saying, right? Because of the potential downsides to these kind of regulatory AI systems. But I guess I'm curious, because when we talk, especially when we talk, I think one of the other downsides is just the idea about popularity. Because the question I think becomes like, so because in my mind, you'd have to, on some level, create a popularity around what is considered a reputable news source. So this becomes another bias system. This bias is built into that system. And then, I guess, the rate of release, so and a few other factors around, what does it mean for us to privilege these sources over others? And so I think it's still going to, it's still going to reproduce a certain way of being that either supports one side over against another, and and I think that's essentially what we're talking about in terms of whose news is fake and whose news isn't. So yeah, no, it's I don't it's probably not the best idea. Yeah.
Thank you both for answering that question. No, and I'm afraid that we are. That's all the time that we have. But I hope this was very informative for our audience, and I want to give a special thank you to Nathan and Phillip for being a part of this great discussion. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded, so it'll be there for you in the future. And I want to thank the audience also for joining us in discussion and for submitting questions as well. And that for the closing, and I invite you to join us for the closing session, which you can go to the events page and click on that session. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the day and evening.
Thanks, Curtis.
So thank you both, Nathan and Phillip.
Thank you. Great conversation, guys.
Yes.